previous video showed the need for a definition of terrorism, and we have discussed several attempts to arrive at a generally accepted definition of the term. In this video we will explore the essence of terrorism. Well, there is not one definition of terrorism, and that's bad, but there is general agreement that the phenomenon of terrorism has many different elements. And there's also more or less agreement that terrorism is an instrument or a tactic of certain groups, be they non-state actors or state actors, to achieve certain goals. Use of force is important, an important part of this instrument or tactic, but it's not its goal. Of course there are exceptions. Sometimes it's not clear what the terrorists want, and sometimes the violence in itself seems to be both a method and a goal. We call this expressive terrorism. There's no difference between method and goal, or it's very unclear. Well, fear finally is one of the key components, and spreading fear is more important than spreading death. So it's not primarily about causing casualties. The goal is not many dead, but many afraid. And terrorists sometimes manage to do that with very limited means, especially in countries that are not that often confronted with terrorism. An example of that is the situation in the Netherlands in the years 2005-2006. In 2006, according to a public opinion poll, the Eurobarometer, 40% of the Dutch consider terrorism to be one of the two most important problems the country was faced with. And they were more afraid than the British and the Spanish, who had just experienced horrible attacks in Madrid, with 200 people being killed, and the London bombings with more than 50 people killed. So what happened in the Netherlands that they were so afraid of terrorism? Well, just one attack by one person killing one other person, the Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh. Well, one could argue that the killer managed to produce a lot of fear out of one single action. I guess too much fear. A well-known scholar that was one of the first to stress that terrorism is not primarily about killing people is Brian Jenkins. In 1975 he wrote, "Terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead." And I agree, and I think this statement is still quite interesting today. Whether or not it's still very relevant given changes in terrorism, terrorism of today is different than the terrorism in 1975, we will discuss in a later video. Well, the essence of terrorism is not only that it's not mainly about killing. Another important element is that the direct targets are not, or only rarely, the main targets. How to explain this? Take for instance the attacks on 9/11. 3,000 people were killed, but they were in many ways the indirect targets. The terrorists didn't want to kill those people, they wanted to attract a lot of attention. The main targets were you and I, who were watching these horrible pictures of people being killed in New York, Washington and Pennsylvania. So the direct targets are not, or only rarely, the main targets of terrorism. So the violence is not aimed at those who die, but those who continue to live. The main target is us, you and me. The terrorist strategy is to kill one or a few and to frighten millions. They want us to overreact, and unfortunately that is quite often the case. Maybe we should try harder not to be afraid, not to overreact. I'm very much a fan of the social movement and slogan, "We are not afraid." People posting pictures or cartoons or using banners to express their resilience to terrorism, stating, "We are not afraid." Well, here you see a picture using the logo of the London Underground as a reaction to the 7/7 London bombings in 2005. But how hard you and I might try, the impact of terrorism can sometimes be very high. media are very important in spreading fear. But the same holds for politicians and public figures. And as a result of this spreading of fear, terrorism and the impact of terrorism can be enormous. It is a big threat, not in physical terms, although too many people die because of terrorism, but the impact is enormous. The impact can be very high on society, on relationships between communities. It can be very high on the economy and on politics. There seems to be some level of agreement on the idea that terrorism is a tool, a mechanism, an instrument to spread fear by the way of using violence in order to impact politics and society. Well, unfortunately, that impact is often enormous, as politics and society tend to overreact after terrorist incidents. And by doing so, we help the terrorists, and that's not a good idea. I'm very much a fan of the idea to show resilience to terrorism and the slogan, "We are not afraid." What are we going to do next week? We will look at the study of terrorism and counterterrorism. We're going to answer the question, what do academia and think tanks have come up with after 9/11? And why is it rather difficult to study terrorism? See you next week.